We, as an organization, are focused on Greater Boston, but we understand that our elected officials have an entire Commonwealth with diverse needs. So we have to show that investment in the MBTA is an investment in the health of not just Greater Boston, but our entire statewide economy. And we actually conducted a report back in 2018 that proved that every year the T generates $11.4 billion for the region. That's a 5-time return on investment, but it shows the value proposition.
Welcome back to another episode of Spilling the Tea, the podcast where we take you behind the scenes of the MBTA, exploring the challenges, improvements, and future of public transit in the region. I'm Andrew Cassidy of the MBTA's Customer and Employee Experience Department. And today, we're joined by Kate Dineen, President and CEO of A Better City, an organization at the forefront of shaping transportation, infrastructure, and climate policy in the region. Kate has a deep background in policy and transit advocacy, working at the highest levels of government in leading efforts to secure critical investments in the MBTA and other key projects. We'll talk about the work A Better City is doing to improve the region's transit network, the impact of recent infrastructure investments, and what's next for transportation policy in Massachusetts. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you have a bit of an interesting career and a diverse one at that, spanning government, policy, nonprofits. What led you to A Better City? And could you tell us a little bit about A Better City?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate in my career to work for a lot of wonderful leaders. And I'm originally from Western Mass, went to grad school here in Boston, and then I worked in New York state government for many years. I also worked for Senator Gillibrand on the federal side. And so it felt like a really nice inflection point after my time in the Cuomo administration to move back to the Boston area to be close to family. And so at that point in my career, I had wonderful opportunities, again, working for the federal side of government and working for many years in state government. I should say, in full disclosure, I did overlap with General Manager Phil Eng in the Cuomo administration. I was in the governor's office when he was at New York State DOT at the time. So I had the pleasure of seeing him in action in that space before he went on to the MTA and the LIRR. And I knew in making my career move back to the Boston area that I wanted to work ideally at the intersection of transportation and climate. And so I started really networking my way back to the area, and I came across an organization called A Better City. And at the time, A Better City was being led by Rick Domino, who is now a member on the MassDOT board. And Rick was at the helm of A Better City for 28 years. So in my various networking conversations, folks had said, have you heard of A Better City? Have you gotten coffee with Rick Domino? So now I like to joke with Rick that I really only wanted coffee and I ended up getting a job. So it was very serendipitous that when I reached out to him cold, he was hiring for a number 2 within A Better City. And so that was almost 6 years ago. So I was just really fortunate to connect at the right time. And A Better City as an entity was something that was really new to me. So I had come out of working primarily in government, and A Better City is a nonprofit. So A Better City is both a 501c3 and 501c4 nonprofit, and it has its roots in transportation in many ways. So the organization was founded back in 1989, and at the time it was called the Artery Business Committee, ABC. And it was a group of really well-organized business and civic leaders who were united around the successful completion of the Central Artery Project, or the Big Dig Project. Wow. And so when that project was completed in the early 2000s, this group of leaders asked themselves, what do we do next? And so the organization has grown and evolved. And in the early 2000s, the organization was rebranded. So ABC became A Better City. And now we have 3 core areas of focus. So transportation and infrastructure, energy and environment, and land use and development. And our focus is not just on the city of Boston, but Greater Boston as a region. So we've really grown in focus and in scope. We have about 130 member companies and institutions who are united around the common goal of building a vibrant, competitive, equitable, sustainable region. And we do that by advocating for and informing solutions at the policy level to build what we think is a more equitable and competitive built environment. So I think that's what really distinguishes us as an organization is our focus on the built environment and really investing in our infrastructure for two reasons. One, because it uplifts our communities, and two, because it makes us more competitive as a region. And so we are a lean team of about a dozen staff. We are located right across from the State House in downtown Boston. And we're very lucky to have an incredible team of planners, architects, policy experts. And we do a lot of our own research and analysis internally and work very collaboratively with our membership base, with a really rich ecosystem of stakeholders, whether they be advocacy groups or business or trade groups. And then, of course, with the Healy Driscoll administration and the Wu administration, and increasingly with leadership in Cambridge as well.
So how is it that A Better City collaborates with the MBTA and other stakeholders to push for meaningful change? What does that relationship look like? And what are some of the important work that ABC has done that people might not know ABC was involved in?
So we do our own independent research. We provide a lot of public testimony, as the MBTA board can attest. We do a fair amount of media engagement, collaboration with MBTA leadership, MassDOT leadership, and stakeholders. And, perhaps above all, we amplify the voices of our membership. So, like I said, we have about 130 member companies and institutions, and our membership is really diverse in that it reflects the major economic drivers of our regional economy. So we have folks who are involved in planning, design, architecture, development, legal services, life sciences, our eds and meds, communications, advertising. There's a really diverse cross section. And so they inform the work that we do. Our membership represents not just the major drivers of the economy, but major employers and thought leaders. And so we draw upon their perspectives and their expertise to inform our research, to inform our testimony, to inform the work that we do in the media. And so over the last decade, A Better City has been a constant voice at MBTA board meetings, at FMCB board meetings when the FMCB existed, and really advocating for public transit enhancement, new investments in the T system, and also new sources of revenue, which I can talk a little bit more about. Like I said, we conduct our own research in-house on a whole range of topics, from the I-90 Alston multimodal project to signals, bus maintenance facilities, federal funding, transportation finance. And so we're very lucky to have an expert team to spearhead that work and also to leverage the expertise of some of our members who do a lot of this analysis as well. We've been so lucky to work closely with MBTA leadership, and not just General Manager Eng, who is so accessible and responsive and collaborative and everybody's fan favorite, but also the whole leadership team here at the T. It doesn't stop at the general manager. There are wonderful folks all around him: Angel Donahue Rodriguez, Lindsay Heffernan, Danny Levy. It's just an incredible team. And everybody is rowing in the same direction. So we think it is an incredibly exciting time for the MBTA and for our region. And we hope that there is a growing awareness that now is the time to get the T the resources it needs. So not just funding, but also new procurement tools, for example, to continue this momentum and continue the progress that we see happening. And so we're going to keep up that type of collaboration. I think when A Better City is doing its job well, we are able to bridge the gaps between the business community, the transportation advocacy community, and government. And so that is kind of our sweet spot. And I think where we work most effectively. And we're really lucky to have amazing partners, both within the advocacy community and also on the business community side.
Makes a lot of sense. And it touches upon something that we discussed back when we had Jared Johnson on from Transit Matters, which is that collaborative relationship. People externally sometimes mistake advocacy and, those they're advocating with as being diametrically opposed. But in fact, they're quite well aligned. Sometimes there might be a difference in opinion on how things should go or timing of certain things, but it is very much a complementary relationship between these two groups. And it's really important because, obviously the more voices that are being heard, usually the better the decision that ends up coming from that. So it's great to hear that A Better City is kind of continuing with that same thought. again, working towards that improvement for, public transportation and then all of the other pieces as well. It's great to hear that there is that relationship and those conversations are being had.
Yeah, and we have done a tremendous amount of work with Transit Matters. They're a great partner organization because we're tackling a lot of the same issues from different perspectives and on behalf of different constituents, frankly. We also have both benefited from investment from the philanthropic sector as well. The Barr Foundation and the Boston Foundation have been incredible supporters of a better city and our transportation work over the years. And we have really leaned in over the past few years on trying to advocate for what we call equity in the built environment. So how do we work alongside organizations like Transit Matters, like T for Mass, and support the MBTA's efforts and RTA's efforts to enhance transit service for environmental justice and transit-dependent communities, for example. So we've also done a lot of collaboration with Transit Matters on commuter rail and realizing what we call a regional rail vision, which is really more frequent, more reliable, and ultimately decarbonized service across our region. So they're a great partner. There are many great partners in this ecosystem. And I think what has been wonderful in the past few years is that the T has really welcomed us as an advocacy community, a stakeholder community, and not just been accessible, has leaned in on trying to get the perspectives of different organizations in making their own decisions about prioritizing service enhancements or capital investments. And so that has been a noteworthy and welcome change. And we're so grateful. I think that leadership we know starts at the top. That starts with Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, Secretary Tibbetts-Nutt, of course, General Manager Eng. And we want to continue that relationship and to keep that momentum going.
It's great to hear that, again, you're having that experience. It's important that these conversations are happening because, as you said, that's how you get a better result with those diverse opinions. But truthfully, the representation of more groups to make sure that everyone's being considered when, major things like capital projects are underway. So you mentioned ABC's connection with the business community. Mm-hmm. How can businesses support the MBTA and ABC's role in building a business coalition that supports the T? What is that intersection between yourselves and that business community, and how are they involved in the MBTA's future and helping kind of advocate for what it is they're looking for? Mm-hmm.
So from a better city's perspective, Greater Boston can't survive, let alone thrive, without a safe, reliable, affordable, accessible. I could keep going with the acronyms. Decarbonized, resilient public transit system, right? We can't be a world-class city and a world-class region without a connected public transit system that is able to meet riders where they are, that is able to become the most convenient choice for somebody trying to navigate their day. And it's not just about serving the needs of commuters, but serving the needs of folks traveling around the region for a variety of reasons. And so I think the MBTA's most recent rider survey had some interesting findings in that folks are using the system differently now, right? Because of, for example, the $10 weekend pass on the commuter rail, people are using the system more on the weekends. They're using the system more, not just for getting to and from work, but for getting to appointments, for recreation, for leisure, right? This needs to evolve to become a system that meets riders' needs and not just kind of that traditional commuter model. And so our membership, who represents some of the major employers of the region, understands how vital the system is to the economic health and competitiveness of our region. And so they're fully on board and supportive of all of our advocacy efforts to improve service and improve connectivity and to move toward building that commuter rail or regional rail of the future, because our economic health and our economic competitiveness depend on it, right? And so when you look beyond the boundaries of Greater Boston, we need more connectivity too with our RTAs, for example. So they get it. Our membership gets it. The business community gets it. And that's why they're so engaged and so supportive of recent efforts that the T has undertaken under the leadership of Secretary Tibbetts-Nutt and General Manager Eng to, for example, remove all slow zones from the subway system in 2024, right? That track improvement program was an incredible success, not just because it removed slow zones and delivered for riders. That time savings is real for people. It also is helping to restore trust in the system to restore trust in leadership and kind of more broadly, trust in government, right? The success of that program is starting to prove that these investments are paying off. And again, I think that tone is set at the top, and Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll were very clear about their emphasis on transportation, on turning a new page. And this is a new chapter for transportation funding in particular in Massachusetts. The care that they took with finding a general manager to lead the T, I think, is another signal about how seriously they're taking this. From a Better Cities perspective, we've been at this for a while now, and we've gone through many administrations. And what we saw a few years ago when the new administration came in is we're trying to deal with decades of underinvestment. And we're chipping away at that now, but making real meaningful progress with programs like the Track Improvement Program. And so now we're very lucky that we welcome General Manager Eng at our board meeting in February. So we have quarterly board meetings where we have representation from all of our member companies and institutions. And the general manager spoke about recent successes, but he also talked about a vision for the future. And I think that vision is really important to show that progress can be made and to show that we're working towards something. So he talked a lot about signals, station accessibility, power redundancy, 2025 maybe being the year of the bus, right? Yep. So it's just really important for riders, for major employers in our region, for the broader business community to see that continued progress, because it makes the case every day for more investment. And that's really what we need. And we can't make that case for more investment without the buy-in of the business community, especially beyond just the borders of Greater Boston as well. You know, we as an organization are focused on Greater Boston, but we understand that our elected officials have an entire Commonwealth with diverse needs, especially of rural and suburban communities who are not directly connected with the MBTA. So we have to show that investment in the MBTA is an investment in the health of not just Greater Boston, but our entire statewide economy. And we actually conducted a report back in 2018 with support from AECOM, who is a member of A Better City, and the Bar Foundation and the Boston Foundation, that proved that every year the T generates $11.4 billion for the region. That's a 5-time return on investment. And those are, now stale numbers, but it shows the value proposition for making continued investment in the system. And it doesn't just benefit Boston or Greater Boston. It benefits the entire Commonwealth. And I would argue also the entire region. I'd say all because, of England. There is not, our borders are of course very porous. So all this is to say that the buy-in and support and engagement of the business community is essential.
It's an interesting subset of the population because people usually talk about ridership. Yeah. They talk about the communities that they serve, but less often, at least externally, not internally, people will bring up the business component. And it's such an integral part. A lot of people don't fully appreciate how the MBTA truthfully is kind of like a circulatory system for the region. Just yesterday, we opened up South Coast Rail. I went down to Fall River. And if you go to right next to where Fall River Station is now, there is development everywhere in that area. I mean, it is just amazing how quickly things sprout up once, they have that accessibility. And I'm sure it's going to take a while for people to try it out, but it's a really interesting piece where there really is that very literal, visible benefit that happens so quickly. We saw it with GLX and now we're seeing it over there. And it just shows the greater potential for what transportation can do for a community.
If you build it, they will come.
That's it. That is it.
And I think the MBTA communities law is a foundational component of that future, right? We at A Better City talk about transit-oriented development, what we call TOD. And so really that is just ensuring that future development, especially multifamily development, mixed-use development, housing development, sorely needed housing development, is clustered around accessible transit nodes. And so I think you're already starting to see that along the new South Coast Rail corridor, which has now taken decades to realize. And congratulations on yesterday's launch. And it's been a long time coming. And I think it's going to be really transformative for our regional economy. And again, not just for serving commuters coming in and out of Boston, but opening access to all these South Coast communities and in terms of visitors as well. So these are obviously two-way tracks. And I think too frequently, we're still kind of trapped in that traditional commuting mindset when we talk about access to Boston, but it's also about access to these communities and igniting those regional economies as well. So it's really exciting.
So I guess going in both directions and looking at both sides of the coin on this, obviously going in a positive direction, exciting times for public transportation, specifically the MBTA, both commuter rail and rapid transit. But the truth is, and being that you kind of represent beyond just Boston itself, the region itself has a lot of transportation issues. Fourth worst in traffic. And then our infrastructure, obviously, it's still aging. It's something that, we're hard at work at getting fixed and remedied, but it is a factor. And obviously climate resistance, crazy winters, crazy summers, everything's on fire. What do you see as, I guess, the biggest hurdles for improving transportation in the region? And I guess, what are ABC's top priorities right now when you have so many individual pieces facing you? What are the ones that you're going after right now?
So funding is the biggest hurdle, right?
Yep.
That is now exacerbated by uncertainty at the federal level. I think we're all trying to figure out every day what new policy decisions mean, what funding freezes mean. And that is kind of the big elephant in the room at every table right now. I think at A Better City, we always try and have a solution-oriented and collaborative posture. So we're thinking about how do we continue to collaborate with our federal partners? Thanks to the leadership of Secretary Tibbetts-Nutt and General Manager Eng, MassDOT and the MBTA have historically had very strong relationships with our federal partners, with USDOT in particular. We have been really lucky to get some sizable federal grants over the past year. A Better City, my colleague Tom Ryan published a report last year called Making a Comeback that really told the story of the Healy Driscoll administration's recent success in securing more and more competitive federal grants, specifically for infrastructure. So the Commonwealth, and I think under the leadership of Quentin Palfrey as well, has done a really fantastic job strategizing about how do we get more than our fair share of competitive federal dollars. The landscape is obviously much different now, but we still need to be solution oriented and figure out how do we retain federal funds and how do we continue to compete for federal funds as well. But resources are limited. And there is tremendous uncertainty at the federal level. So that's kind of the pall that is cast over all this progress right now. And I think we should just acknowledge that and name that. Luckily, we do have a healthy budget. It's a more constrained state budget this year, but we do have resources like the fair share surtax. Some folks call it the millionaire's tax. And that revenue is stronger than initially forecast and is designed to go toward transportation and education needs. So I think you saw in the governor's proposed budget to invest $8 billion over the next decade in our transportation infrastructure that the state has a plan, regardless of what happens at the federal level. And I think we all need organizations like A Better City and others to continue to lean in and be at the table in advocating for these investments, but also trying to identify new sources of revenue moving forward that can be directed to meet both the capital and operating needs of the MBTA. So, the biggest hurdle I think is funding, but we can't shy away from, leaning in on the investments that are currently needed. Our top priorities as an organization include continuing to improve transit service. The new commuter rail procurement is coming up, which is a big thing to watch. I think, as folks know, Keolis is the current operator of the commuter rail. I think they've done a tremendous job at bringing ridership back to the commuter rail system in the wake of the pandemic. If you look at where our commuter rail compares to peers, we're doing a bit better compared to most of our peers in bringing folks back to the system. The ridership rebound is well into the 90s now, 95, 96%. I don't have the latest data, but that ridership rebound is really impressive. And I think a testament to increased reliability and performance on the system. So I think that is a big deal that should be acknowledged. The upcoming commuter rail procurement is a really important inflection point because depending on how it's structured, depending on the scope and duration, and this could really lay the groundwork for the longer term transformation of the system. So I mentioned earlier that concept of regional rail. And so as a Commonwealth and as a region, I think it is imperative for us to use the wonderful foundation that our commuter rail system provides and to improve upon that. How do we make the commuter rail? And, when my mom asked me, what do you mean about regional rail, right? What is regional rail? Yeah. I'm like, okay, Mom, we want to try and make the commuter rail less like an Amtrak and more like a subway. She's like, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
So more frequent, more reliable. You miss a train, not a big deal. There's another one coming. And then, of course, decarbonizing the system as well, electrifying the system, and then making it more resilient to climate threats like extreme temperature and flooding, of course. So that's a big priority for ours that we need to continue to advance. You mentioned before transportation-oriented development or transit-oriented development opportunities that are really enabled by or supported by the MBTA communities law. And then we do a lot of work also on the kind of first and last mile gaps, right? How do we integrate active transportation like blue bikes, for example? How do we begin to think more holistically about blue bikes as being part of our transit system, right? Not an accessory to the system. So integrating stations, making riders, commuters, travelers for any reason aware of walking and biking opportunities, active transportation integration. We talk a lot and think a lot about expanding and integrating ferry service as well, which I think is something that was a really successful outcome of the Sumner Tunnel closure, particularly 2 summers ago. Wildly popular free or subsidized ferry service. And riders are clamoring for that. Like, where else can we integrate ferry service? Where are we seeing ridership potential? And folks who take ferries will tell you it's like the best way to commute in the area. So that's something that continues to be a priority for ours. And then also realizing big, once in a generation transformative projects like the I-90 Austin multimodal project that A Better City has been working on now for over a decade. So my colleague, Tom Nally, has been on the formal project task force now for, I think, over 10 years. And so that is a mega project that recently received a very sizable federal grant that would bring the Mass Pike down to, we call it at grade, but ground level, straighten out the roadway, restore the riverbank, create new active transportation and cycling opportunities along the river and in connection with Alston, and really excitingly establish a new stop on the commuter rail to be known as West Station and open up an area called Beacon Park Yard to new development. So from my perspective, I live in Boston and I see this as a once in a generation opportunity to build a new neighborhood within the city of Boston and meet some of our dire housing production needs and connect with Kendall Square and Worcester. And we actually, at A Better City, completed an economic benefits analysis with AECOM to try and forecast some of the benefits of developing just part of Beacon Park Yard. So there's a tremendous amount of connectivity there that can happen between Harvard and BU, which when you kind of describe this to someone in the abstract, they're like, you can connect Harvard and BU. You can connect Harvard and BU. And there's a tremendous amount of development going on at the Harvard Enterprise Research Campus with Tishman Speyer. So there's just so much already happening in Alston. And this is a project that would really stitch it all together and reconnect communities, create jobs, generate a tremendous amount of GDP. And so that is one of the big projects that A Better City has been deeply involved in advocating for and working with MassDOT. So we have a host of transportation priorities that we are going to continue to push for despite the limited resources. And so I think it's important to have, especially in times of uncertainty and resource constraints, to have a lot of stakeholders at the table to help prioritize, what should be advanced and when. And, like I said at the beginning, from A Better City's perspective, the MBTA system is the engine of our regional economy. And so we need to continue to invest in that system, to enhance that system, and ensure that it has both the capital and operating resources needed to keep the momentum going.
You brought it up, I think, twice now. So just to clarify, I guess, for those who are less familiar, the MBTA Communities Act.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little about that? I think a lot of people think first off, they think it's the MBTA doing it.
Oh, yeah.
Which, obviously that's not our wheelhouse. We just provide the actual public transportation service, not the bills and what have you. But can you talk a little about what that is and kind of how it's going as of right now?
Yeah, so at a really high level, the MBTA Communities Act was initiated by the Baker administration and then signed into law. And it essentially requires certain municipalities to allow for the development of more dense housing around transit nodes. So you can go online and see all of the listed MBTA communities. And in order to comply with this now law, you're seeing this happen right now in local town referendums. towns and cities who are required to comply are passing new zoning. So essentially, new local regulations. So zoning's handled at the local level that would enable more dense development around transportation stations. And so the intent there, again, is I think a really simple and unimpeachable one, in that areas that are served by transit, whether it be subway service or commuter rail service, are the most appropriate and also the most exciting for new housing development, especially denser multifamily housing development. And I myself am not a housing expert. At A Better City, we look at housing from the perspective of transportation and also development policies. But anyone who is a transportation or a housing expert who you have on the program will tell you that we have a housing crisis as a Commonwealth. That is true across the entire state. And so the MBTA Communities Law is a tool for enabling new development to help us meet our housing production targets and to help us address our housing affordability crisis. How's it going? It's going pretty well overall, but you see some towns who are not in compliance. So there have been some very, public battles around this where certain towns have voted not to change their zoning, not to upzone, and therefore out of compliance. And we shall see what legal action is kind of transpires after that. I think the Attorney General has been really clear, and the administration has been very clear that they're serious about enforcing this. I do think it's also worth noting that what the law essentially requires is a zoning change. It does not guarantee that this development's going to happen, right? It just kind of lays the groundwork for this development to happen. And the hope is that developers, some of whom are reflected on A Better Cities board, will be able to come in and make proposals that are appropriate for and tailored to the specific needs of that community. And so it is not, I think there's a misconception that it is like requiring development to happen immediately. It's really requiring zoning changes that may enable that development. So it's kind of a nuance, but I think it's largely going pretty well. But there are some pretty public, prominent cases of, let's say, noncompliance right now.
But the vast majority, to the best of my knowledge, are in compliance.
Vast majority. And when people hear MBTA Communities Law, it's not something that the MBTA is enforcing or proposed, right?
Yeah.
It is in reference to the existing transit infrastructure that is there.
We get a lot of emails.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that, funding is probably your top dragon to slay.
Yeah.
Obviously a major factor for the MBTA. You were appointed to Governor Healey's Transportation Funding Task Force. How do you see that influencing the future of MBTA funding beyond obviously that $8 billion that's already been earmarked for public transportation across the state?
Well, first of all, I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to serve on the governor's Transportation Funding Task Force. The governor, I think, assembled a really wonderful group of both private and public sector folks to tackle the transportation funding crisis head on. And that's not something we've always seen. And so I think that was a really welcome change. And again, I was just so grateful and energized to be at the table and to be able to represent the perspectives of our membership. So I think you see in the final task force report, which you can find online, that there are really kind of three suites of recommendations. So the first suite of recommendations is the proposal to stabilize the system. And you saw the governor take immediate action to build upon the recommendations of the task force in proposing use of the fair share dollars to stabilize the MBTA and also our statewide transportation system. There are two other buckets of recommendations in there described as enhance and transform that really take a more medium and long-term view and try to answer the question, how can we continue to identify new sources of revenue to invest in our broadly defined statewide transportation system? So I think it's important to note that the task force was charged with not just looking at the needs of the MBTA, not just looking at the needs of public transit, but of all of our statewide transportation needs. So we're talking about the MBTA regional transit authorities, RTAs, our roads, our bridges, our tunnels. We talked a lot about culverts, which your listeners may not know what a culvert is, but it's kind of smaller infrastructure in more rural and suburban areas. They're very vulnerable to flooding and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I'm describing all this because it was a large scope. And so from a Better Cities perspective, representing the greater Boston business community, it was important for us in that process to ensure that the MBTA was prioritized for near-term funding in terms of stabilizing both the operating and capital needs of the system. And so we were very encouraged by the governor's budget proposal, in part because of what it is poised to deliver for the MBTA system. Again, with the acknowledgement that investing in the MBTA does not just benefit Greater Boston, but it benefits the entire Commonwealth, the entire economy of the Commonwealth in many different ways. Yeah. And so we're really encouraged by that. We're now going to be working with our partners in the legislature, both the House and Senate, to understand what their proposals are shaping up to look like, both when it comes to the T's needs, but also our statewide transportation needs. Ernst & Young was a consultant on the task force process. I think they did a really wonderful job analyzing what other states and regions are doing to fund their transportation system. So I encourage folks, if you're like a policy nerd, to take a look at some of the appendices in the task force report. There's a lot of substance there that I think will continue to guide us in the coming years. And, if you look at, for example, the enhance bucket of recommendations, there is a suggestion in there from the task force that the state, so the administration and the legislature, take a look at existing transportation fees and see how we compare to peer states. And so you'll see in there that there are some charts that show, okay, how does Massachusetts compare when it comes to things like RMV fees or the gas tax? And so there's, some instructive trends there. So there is more analysis and work to be done around some of those enhance and transform recommendations. But the near-term priority is, of course, to stabilize.
Of course.
And that is, the imperative of this upcoming legislative session and where we're going to really be leaning in. I also just want to give a shout out to some partners on the task force that I worked really closely with. The Mass Taxpayers Foundation and the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce in particular were wonderful partners and representing the perspectives of the business community as well. And, it was a pleasure to work alongside everybody on that task force.
So to add to the controversy, I have to ask, just because I recently got back from a conference. New York was there, MTA was there, and they were singing the praises of their recently implemented congestion pricing, which is basically just, increased fees during peak times. And they were celebrating it. Obviously, it's got national attention now, with the federal government telling them to stop and threatening funding for them. What is ABC's thought on that approach, or any others, I guess, that are kind of more outside the box thinking? I know this existed in London long before New York, but other kind of maybe better suited to Boston options that, people could consider when it comes to finding additional revenue sources for the T.
First, I have to state the obvious that Boston is not New York.
Yes.
And despite the fact I worked in New York for 10 years, I was never a Yankees fan or a Mets fan. And
does that mean a Red Sox fan?
I was a Red Sox fan. Always a Red Sox fan.
Yeah.
And I think Phil's a Mets fan,
Mets
right?
Fan,
okay,
yes.
Yeah. But there are very different contexts. Downtown Boston is not Manhattan. So, we just need to acknowledge that reality up front. I also should say that I was working in state government when the concept of congestion pricing was really gaining traction within New York City. Mm-hmm. So I think this was back in 2015 or 2016 when we in the governor's office thought we were very close to congestion pricing. So that just tells you how long some of these things take, right? Congestion pricing was implemented in 2024 in New York. So different contexts, very long time horizon. However, I think if you take a look at the language in the Transportation Funding Task Force report, you will see a nod to establishing a phased approach to a more equitable roadway pricing network. So people may not understand what that means kind of at first blush, but A Better City's done a fair amount of analysis around what we call roadway pricing. And that's, kind of more plainly tolling infrastructure. Mm. So a phased approach to establishing a different roadway pricing network could look like, okay, phase one, let's take a look at where we have existing tolls and why. If you're driving around Greater Boston, you will know that certain roads and certain bridges and certain tunnels are tolled and others are not. And you may ask why, right? You may ask, is that fair? We can also take a look at our existing tolling amounts. If you look in the appendix of the task force report, you will see how we align with peers. You may also notice that we haven't increased tolls in many years. So that could be like a phase one analysis of like looking at our existing tolling infrastructure, asking why we have tolls in certain places and not others, asking where we might want to add new tolls, where we might want to remove existing tolls. Do we want to toy with different tolling amounts, different rebates or exemptions? And I think then down the road, we could ask ourselves if something akin to congestion pricing might make sense in certain places. Congestion pricing is kind of an incendiary or like hot button phrase. What we like to talk about is variable time of day pricing, right? Do you have lanes on certain roads that cost more during peak travel hours, right? That's more of like a managed lane type model. So I think as a region, we should be asking ourselves these questions. We should be looking at our existing infrastructure. We should be asking ourselves, are these tolling amounts correct? Are these tolling locations correct? And then I think several years down the road, when we have tolls where we think we want them and need them, then maybe you can start experimenting with some sort of pilot with a variable time of day pricing. Someone might call that congestion pricing. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about tolling and roadway pricing. And I think it's really important to note that any sort of pricing approach will need to have, rebates or exemptions to protect low-income drivers, frankly. And so that can be all part of this. Once you have tolling infrastructure in place, and my colleague Jim Aloisi has spoken at length about this and much more eloquently than I, but it can be a very flexible system, right? A very flexible policy system to change behavior. We talk a lot in the policy space about, quote, mode shift. And what that means is really incentivizing people to get out of their cars and to take public transit, right? It's how do we reduce the number of drivers on the road? How do we reduce the use of single occupancy vehicles? That's really what we mean by mode shift. We also talk a lot about VMT reduction, vehicle miles traveled reduction. That just means like driving less, right? People driving less. So something like a roadway pricing infrastructure that has a variable time of day pricing component or a congestion pricing component has many benefits to a region like New York. And we're starting to see some data from their kind of short-lived plan in that it is reducing congestion. It is improving travel time. We know it is reducing emissions. So it is raising revenue and it is encouraging people to take transit. So, there are kind of multiple co-benefits of a system like this that can make it more expensive, frankly, to drive, raising new revenue that can be invested in the transportation system, the public transit system and the roadway system to make, for better driving and transit experiences. And then, you reap all these additional benefits of reduced traffic, better air quality, et cetera. So I think we are a long way away from experimenting with a policy like that in Greater Boston. But I think it's fair to be asking ourselves these hard questions right now about our existing tolling infrastructure, our existing tolling amounts, and what a more equitable roadway pricing system could look like in Greater Boston. But, that is not like a tomorrow thing. That is like we need to start doing our homework tomorrow thing, but not implementing these changes. But, I would be remiss not to emphasize that our funding needs are so great here in the Commonwealth that we really do need to have all options on the table. We need to be assessing all options for not just raising new revenue, for investing in our broadly defined transportation system, so our roads, bridges, tunnels, culverts, public transit, but also thinking really seriously about policy changes that can encourage behavior change as well. But at the end of the day, I think we want to invest in our MBTA system and our public transit because the hope is that it will become so convenient that people want to take the commuter rail. They want to take the subway or the bus or the ferry because it is the mode of choice, right? It's just better, it's easier, it's faster, it's more reliable than driving. So, there's always a question of like the carrot or the stick. And I think our hope is that, we can leverage fair share dollars in the near term to make these investments in the system to enhance service and improve the experience for riders that more people want to take public transit. Not, we're disincentivizing them in other ways from driving, right? Yeah. But we're creating the system of choice. We're making it the most attractive, most convenient option. And I think we're starting to get there.
And that's something that I know GMing brings up quite a bit is the preferred choice.
Yes, preferred choice.
And it is super important. And again, anytime I think I might be saving time by driving, I always, without fail, regret that decision just because of all of the headaches that are involved with being stuck in traffic. With one day, I literally was thinking about which one, and ended up getting a flat tire in the rain. It was just like all the things that I could have avoided, which is why I'm 99% of the time taking the train. But again, I think step one is getting on board and seeing the state of the MBTA now.
Right.
And I guess on that note of where we are today, I'd like to ask you to look beyond today to the future and just kind of share what your vision for the future of transportation in the region is and what steps need to happen either on your end, our end, the state level. What steps need to happen to kind of realize that?
So my vision for
Dream
the
big,
future
dream big.
is that our system is convenient, connected, reliable, safe, affordable, accessible, decarbonized, and resilient. That is the vision. And I think that's a vision that's shared by all. How we get there is going to require a tremendous amount of investment. And again, both capital and operating. So we need to make sure that the MBTA has those needs met, right? I think a lot of times we hear about the fiscal cliff, which is just a scary way of saying a funding gap, right? We need to fill the T's operational and capital funding gaps. And we need to continue to keep the momentum going and to show progress. So I think that what has been so impactful about the success of the track improvement program, right, is tangible benefits to riders, time savings for riders. And you continue to hear it, right? Like one of my board members, shout out to Jean Panato, was really early for a meeting the other day because she commutes in from JP on the Orange Line. She's like, sorry, the Orange Line was really fast. So I'm still getting used to it, right? I'm still getting used to it. My day is different, right? And so now we're beyond the track improvement plan. And we know that the MBTA is now focused on a suite of priorities for 2025. There are going to be disruptions in service, right? There are going to be diversions. We need to work together to ensure that there is robust communication about those service disruptions, that when the T has to use shuttles, for example, that they're accessible, there's great wayfinding, there are ambassadors out there, there's as much advance notice as possible, there's integration with Blue Bikes, right? We can work together and continue to do that because we have to continue to prove that the short-term pain to riders is worth the long-term gain. And, it's not like the slow zones are removed, so we're done, right? There's all of this seen and unseen work that is happening, but it's being done to deliver for riders at the end of the day, right? And we have to keep showing riders what they're gaining from the work that's being done, whether it be on signals or station accessibility, whether it be changes to bus routes, which is a really hard thing, right? The bus network redesign, I think, is an important initiative that's underway, but it can be really disruptive for folks who are used to their bus routes being at, their bus stop being at a certain place, right? Like change is really difficult, but we have to explain why it's happening and why it's ultimately benefiting riders in the medium and long term. So I think that communication and coordination is really key to keeping folks on board, right? Like there's so much growing trust in MBTA leadership. And I think everybody's fear is like the other shoe is going to drop and we're going to lose the riding public. We're going to lose the elected officials. They're going to lose patience, right? They're going to lose focus. But if we continue to communicate and work together and show the gains, I think that is how we keep people literally and figuratively on board and continue to make the case for investment in the system. There are a lot of exciting initiatives that are underway. I mentioned the commuter rail procurement. That's a big one that we're all watching to see how that's structured and kind of what longer term enhancements might be part of this upcoming contract. There are big projects like the South Coast Rail announcement yesterday, the I-90 Austin multimodal project that I mentioned, critical station accessibility enhancements. And I know accessibility is a priority of the MBTA leadership team, and that can't be, I think, understated. I think that is something that's been deprioritized for many years. And so it's really exciting and important and long overdue to be seeing an emphasis there. We, of course, are excited about new red and orange line cars and the new Type 10 green line cars, ferry service expansion and integration, and really that unseen work, that foundational track work, power system work. Nobody knows it's there. Nobody should know it's there. We just want to know that it's functioning properly, right? And that it is allowing trains to run more reliably and closer together. And so kind of explaining what that foundational work is and how it ultimately benefits riders at the end of the day, I think is really important. But there's a lot of exciting work underway. I think as an organization, A Better City also continues to emphasize kind of these long under design mega projects like the Red Blue Connector, for example, that has been advanced over the past couple of years. So, there's always this tension or balance between prioritizing the most critical needs to serve the most riders and then also continuing to advance those longer term, larger capital projects that are needed to modernize the system and to ensure that our region and our economy continue to grow. And so I think you will need support from organizations on the outside, like A Better City and others who are saying, wait, this is all great, but don't forget about these impactful projects like the Red Blue Connector, for example, like the I-90 Alston multimodal project that are needed to ensure that we're not just essentially addressing a state of good repair backlog, but we are building out the system. And that's what's really exciting about like GLX and South Coast Rail is building out the system, not just enhancing or maintaining our existing footprint. And so again, there's a tension or a balancing act there, but we need to do both.
Yeah, it's always exciting to bring new communities into the party.
Yes.
As you said, it is absolutely an exciting time at the T. There's a lot to be done, but there's a lot happening, and it's just going absolutely in the right trajectory. It's great to know that, during this time, between the MBTA and ABC, we're quite in lockstep, just kind of pushing forward for the betterment of public transportation in the region.
Absolutely. And, we as an organization, again, working with our membership, are always looking for ways to highlight gaps, right? So we have a lot of major employers in the seaport, for example. So we're always thinking about, okay, how can we continue to enhance access to the seaport through the Silver Line and other approaches? We're also continuing to work with partners like Transit Matters, T4Mass, Livable Streets, and others to ask the question, how can we continue to enhance access for transit-dependent environmental justice communities? And also frontline workers. We've done a lot of work with our eds and meds. Our major hospitals have shift workers who may not have been previously served by certain bus lines. And I think, the T has been really open and collaborative to meeting with folks to understand the unique needs of some of our major employers to make sure that the system is evolving to support their needs. So like you said, there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, and limited resources. So, we look forward to continuing to work together to help with that prioritization and really to help fight for continued investment in the system. And I think that is now more important than ever. And there is a growing consensus that now is the time, with the current leadership in place, to get the T the resources they need to keep building momentum and to get the job done. And that goodwill has not always been there. And so we really need to strike while the iron is hot to keep it going. And I think we have a really good shot with the governor's budget proposal on the table to deliver for the T and to deliver for riders and for our regional economy.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. This has been extremely informative, but also just reigniting that invigoration of what's possible for the T.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and so grateful for everything that your team is doing.
That brings us to the end of another episode of Spilling the Tea. We covered a lot today, from the challenges and opportunities for our transportation network to the policy changes and investments that could shape the future of the MBTA. A huge thank you to Kate Dineen for sharing her insights. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for future episodes, send us an email to social@mbta.com. And Until next time, I'm Andrew Cassidy, and this has been Spilling the Tea.